want to be I have no fondue. So sign up. If you want to go skiing at the end of this session, the ski guides today will be Katrin and Menno. And I found out earlier, by the way, that Katrin is actually a sponsored skier. So yesterday, when I was keeping up with it, I was just being toyed with, and then she will just tear off down the mountain at some point if you upset her. But they'll be there straight afterwards if you want to join the ski groups this afternoon. So we're gonna have a change of theme now. And we've been talking, yesterday a lot of very in-depth data and physiological stuff, and a lot of technical, interesting stuff this morning. And actually, like they said, that guy that discovered sepsis, if you can't convince anyone to do what you want to do, you're pretty screwed. So, this is going to be more about how we get our teams to work, because we can turn up with all the toys, all the kit, all the knowledge, but if we can't get the scene to work, if we can't get our team to work, it's not going to work. So we're going to start talking about some non-technical skills. Now, the next speaker is someone I've known for a very, very, very long time. I almost when I had hair, but not quite. I think I was still bald then. So MJ, or she's known as MJ, but does anyone know her real name is actually Mariki? So MJ and I trained together in the Oxford Deanery, and we started working together on the aircraft in Thames Valley and on the cars for basics in that region as well. And we actually had probably one of my most fun weeks together, where we were learning how to drive cars fast under blue lights. And I can say South Africans drive fast normally, but fuck, when you give her blue lights. So she's an incredibly accomplished pre-hospital care physician and an incredibly accomplished physician as well. She's worked together. We've worked at Thames Valley Air Ambulance. She's worked in Australasia, and she's also worked at London Hems as well. And now she's moved to a colder climate in British Columbia with unique challenges of its own, and taken over the intensive care unit in George, is that the right name?
Prince George.
Prince George, sorry. Well, we're losing princes left, right and centre.
We're taking them, actually.
Yeah, I know. So let me give you MJ Slabbert.
Excellent. Thanks for that introduction, John. Right. It was just a quiet, boring morning. And we were all just relaxing and hanging out, when suddenly we found ourselves in this chaotic scene, with people everywhere, and everybody's talking at the same time, and alarms going off all the time. Now this can be any day of the year, any time, happening to any one of us in this audience. Because, oh, that's way too loud. Because in the kind of environments that we work in, which is emergency care, helicopters, intensive care and trauma, we might very quickly find ourselves in volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous environments. Now, it makes sense when we think of leadership and leading in these environments that there must be some special consideration to that as well. I don't know about you, but I received quite a lot of training in CPR and in airway management, but not that much within leadership. So like any rational being, I decided to go and look for some. And I stumbled upon an MBA in leadership and management. Because I feel sometimes it's worth knowing the basics. So I'm going to give you a crash course on MBA in leadership and management. So here are the 8 most established theories in leadership. We'll quickly run through them. First is the great man theory, basically saying that leaders are born. You are charismatic and bigger than life, and then, hey, you're a leader. The trait theory is basically almost the same. You are born with inherited traits that will make you a great leader. And there are some personalities who are more geared towards leadership. These are sort of the extroverts, the courageous. But then, in contrast, there's the behavioral theory that actually states, wait a second, it's not about your internal being, it's about your behavior as a leader. Therefore, anyone can be taught to be a leader. Then there's the participation theory that managers love so much. You know, everybody gets their say, there's pie charts, and we do a whole mapping of the process. And unfortunately, that also leads sometimes to delayed decision-making, indecisiveness, and peer pressure. And then there's the relationship theory and the managerial theory. One is really transactional. It's based on reward or harm. And the other one is more about motivation. There's two theories that does relate a little bit to our types of chaotic, complex, volatile type environments. And that's the contingency theory and the situational theory. And basically both of them sort of says one style of leadership cannot be used in all conditions. And that's you should adapt your leadership style basically to the situation you're facing. Now the problem with some of these theories are that they've elevated leaders to this amazing superhuman. And unfortunately, with the evolution of politics in the 21st century, this has also created some of these clowns who are great leaders. The greatest, in fact. The other problem as well is that these leadership theories were basically created for people in boardrooms as well as the industry, where you get to sit with a clip chart and some sandwiches and pie charts and etc., etc. And not everybody in that boardroom will ever be expected to be leaders. However, if you finished paramedic school or nursing school or medical school, all of you at some point will be expected to be a leader. And very often in very potentially chaotic situations. So therefore it makes sense to maybe look at leadership in those environments. There is a concept actually within leadership theory called VUCA leadership. Now I first stumbled upon this when I asked, or well, I tried to explain to the academics in my MBA that a lot of these leadership theories really don't apply to my profession. And they sort of mentioned, oh yeah, there is something called VUCA leadership for volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous environments. To be honest, they weren't very keen to elaborate on this because I don't think it fits their nice, sterile leadership theories. But it is very often the type of environments that we find ourselves in. And if you think it doesn't apply to you, just have a look at this. This is a little article about decision-making in intensive care medicine. It is a complex area with high stakes, difficult emotive decision-making, with limited patient information, uncertainty, extreme pressure to make decisions quickly, with lack of clear guidelines. That sounds pretty volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous to me. Ring a bell? Situations like these can become quite chaotic if there's no good leadership, with people speaking over one another all the time, and alarms going off all the time, and difficulty to predict what happens next. Or this scene in the OR. And very often, these are high-risk times, very little information, very quick decisions need to be made. And there's often very high-risk procedures involved. And as we found out, there's many moving parts, really intertwined. And therefore it is important to realize that we need to look at leadership a little bit differently than the guys look at leadership within the boardroom. But it is absolutely vital if we want to help our patients. So the first day you guys had a really deep physiological dive. So this is not that deep a dive. But it is important to understand how these environments, the VUCA and hectic environments that we find ourselves in, how it affects how we perform, as well as how our team performs, so that we can better lead them. So there is something called the Trinity of Stress. And we're really talking here about performance under stress. And this was by Peter Hancock and James Salma. And they actually says stress is an interactive process. You have the input, which could be the environment, which could be heat, noise, vibration, but it can also be the task itself. And then you have the adaptation, which is your psychological appraisal of the situation. And then you have your output, which is your behavior. Now, usually your adaptation to stress is a stable state. But when you lose that ability to adapt to the input, then you actually lose control, you lose your perception, and you lose your ability to perform and lead. There's a very good blog written by Robert Lloyd, who's a junior doctor who went to go and spend 3 months working in South Africa, where I qualified and trained, spent my first 3 years working as well. And he explains in his blog very vividly how he experienced working in a very high-stressed environment. He explained having tachycardias, that he felt as palpitations, ringing in his ears with auditory exclusion. He had these pervasive negative thoughts. He had the inability to prioritize tasks. And all of that actually paralyzed his decision-making. It's a very visceral feeling that you can get when you're really overstressed and you feel overwhelmed by the situation you're in. And you might have seen this chart, which is the Siddle Heart Performance Chart. It's on the MCRIT podcast as well as on this guy's blog. And it actually relates sort of heart rate to performance. But it is a little bit deceiving, because if you think 100-meter sprint athletes probably perform at a heart rate of about 180 to 200 beats per minute. And according to this chart, they'll be pooping their pants every time they run. It is not actually your heart rate that has anything to do with the stress. But as we know, we have this neurohormonal influx of adrenaline and noradrenaline. So here's the bit of physiology, but just to remind you guys, it's all about the sympatho-adrenal response. You activate your autonomic nervous system, and it is really your sympathetic nervous system that takes over and floods your body with adrenaline and noradrenaline. You also have your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis that gets activated, and again, it liberates adrenaline from your adrenals as well as cortisol. Now, cortisol increases your blood glucose by actually creating more glucose as well as liberating fatty acids. And the whole reason your body is trying to do that is because it is expecting an expenditure of energy. Now, all of this then creates a rapid heart rate, rapid breathing, high blood flow. Everything goes to your brain, your heart, and your muscles. Now, this is all great, right? In the short term, you get the advantage of increased strength, increased resistance, and attention. And this increases your short-term survival. Unfortunately, when you have a maladaptive response to stress, all the blocks come tumbling down. Basically, your cognitive processes and the way you manage information completely changes. You have a breakdown in how you perceive things, where you get visual tunnel vision and you get auditory exclusion, and it's very difficult to focus on more than one detail at a time. And this has been shown in some of the police literature where police have missed someone dropping a gun before they shot them. As well, it's very hard to recall events in a very good fashion. So I've experienced something like this once on scene. I was just starting out in pre-hospital care, and it was in the nighttime. We went out with our car with a little torch. It was raining, and it was a street sweeper that hit a pedestrian. And the pedestrian was really, really sick. And I worked on the pedestrian, we RSI'd the pedestrian, and we actually took her to the hospital. And afterwards, as you do, we debriefed the job. And we tried to look at things that we could do better. And the paramedic said, well, you know what, that sweeper vehicle was really, really noisy. Maybe we should have asked someone to switch it off. And hand on my heart, I never heard it. I never heard this sweeper vehicle. I was completely task-focused with complete auditory exclusion. So it does happen. Equally, decision-making is really, really tricky when you are under stress from a shock. So they've done this great study in the laboratory where they looked at decision-making and what people do when they are at risk of injury or stressed. And they actually found that people revert to their basic, non-flexible way of decision-making. They exclude any other options of how to look at the problem and think around the box. And we see that in some of the courses that we run. This is an attack course where actually my husband was playing a casualty. He was playing a hypoglycemic driver who went over a pram and crashed his truck into a building that then collapsed. And this team had to come and treat him. And you would not believe it. Although they identified he had bilateral air entry, they were completely task-focused on giving him a thoracostomy. Because in the previous scenario, that's what they missed. And they were under so much stress with a simulated dead baby there and a building collapse and this unconscious man, they couldn't figure out why. But they didn't even try. Because under stress, you revert to, well, let's just do this. And we know verbal communication also struggles. This is a really great study that you might have seen before, where they looked at how communication in a simulated stress scenario within the OR affected performance of anesthesiologists. And they found that if a surgeon was supportive and polite, 91% of an anesthesiologist performed to the level required. But if he was rude and there was really a breakdown of communication, only 63.6% performed to what they would expect the level of performance would be. So we now know about leadership theories. Congratulations. We also know that stress really affects us physiologically and therefore our team as well. And we have to take that into account when we lead and how we teach how to lead within these environments. So what is the fix? Well, first, we can just keep on doing what we've always done before and everything will be fine. Or you can pretend like my cat. You just want to fit in. He pretends he's a plushie or a soft toy and hope I don't see him. So you can maybe just want to fit in and just leave things be. Or you can try and strengthen this leadership behavior that we all find in our difficult environments by thinking of some innovative ways of training. So firstly, what you have to understand is that one leadership way does not fit all situations. You will flex between autocratic and democratic, depending on your team composition and depending on what the scenario calls for. But we are in hectic VUCA environments, and there are some ways how to counteract volatility, and that's with vision. And vision, what I do is, in practice, I try and create small areas of success. So a patient comes into the trauma bay, A, B, C, D, E, quick review, and then, okay, the plan is within 20 minutes we want to be in the CT scan. Let's do X, Y, Z. 10 minutes later, okay, we've 10 minutes left. What do we still need to do? What's going to stop us from being where we want to be? And I did the same thing on scene as well. Right, we have 10 minutes, we've been on scene 10 minutes. What's keeping us here? And by having that sort of vision oversight, you create these small incentives for the team to perform. And it's amazing how that boosts morale. And then understanding. Again, understanding is about being able to stand back. And that counteracts uncertainty by just understanding the situation and seeing how all the components fit together. And then clarity can counteract complexity and making sense of the chaos. And the way you do this practically is with task allocation and shared mental model. And then agility can counteract ambiguity. And what I mean by agility is you have to be willing to sometimes think outside the box and take some calculated risks. In practice, how can you train for this? Well, mental rehearsals and actual rehearsals. So in mental rehearsals, they've done a little study, Loreto Hicks et al. In 2015, where they looked at systematic mental rehearsal for managing a trauma patient compared to traditional ATLS training. And they actually found that the people who does the mental rehearsal did so much better than the people who actually just did the traditional ATLS training, which is quite interesting if you think about it. The other thing is look at other places that are also stressed environments, and you wouldn't believe it, but we can learn a lot about orchestra conductors and how they direct the orchestra. They're in total control. They are calm, they're confident, they're competent, and they have an oversight. They don't micromanage the airway, the violinist when they run a trauma service, an orchestra. where we sometimes want to micromanage whoever's doing the airway or whoever's putting in the tube. The conductor has to stand back and keep an eye over the whole situation. But he needs to know everyone's part as well. And sometimes, you know, in a live orchestra performance, there's no time out, let's have a quick discussion. So sometimes there's a situation where he has to adapt as well. And there's some interesting literature on this as well. That's one article quoted where they actually looked at training emergency physicians and nurses by having them conduct a ghetto blaster orchestra. They put them under stress in a safe environment and then reviewed their performance afterwards. And actually it did show that they had more calmness and better awareness of the whole system. So you can think of innovative ways of training your leaders. This is another way where they blindfolded the team leader, and this improves communication, two-way communication. Another thing is scenario training. And this, when you do scenario training, do you only focus on performing the task, or do you actually focus on team composition, how the team's performing and how the leader is performing? Because there's a lot of value in simulation training, because it gives you the opportunity to do role reversal. Everybody gets time to lead. You get to see how the whole team performs. It builds confidence when you actually have to face a really tough situation in real life. But you have to do it well, and you have to focus specifically on really stressing the leaders as well. And we try and do that pretty well in the attack course. Everybody is the same, whether you're a paramedic, a nurse, a consultant, anesthesiologist. You are in your yellow jumpsuit with a number on. We rotate the leadership as well. And then we have really, really immersive scenarios that we run. I just want you to look at the scenario and the decision making by the team leader, who's not a doctor, by the way, but he has 2 anesthesiologists in his team, just by FYI, and just his clear direction and quick, rapid decision making under very, very VUCA conditions. Can you put the volume up, please? Up, 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 up.
He's got a knife. He's got a knife. What? He's got a knife. Okay, he's got a knife.
Okay, so that is a very, very intense scenario. If you're actually there, you could smell the musty smell in that area. It's dark, it's noisy. Did you hear the dog barking? And he went in and immediately assessed the scenario. He didn't say, "So team, what do you guys think we should do?" He went like, "There's a knife, back, back, back." He's got a knife, back, back, back. And that's all he said. And he probably saved his whole team by doing that. Then things are very useful is pre-briefs and debriefs. And there is some military literature that actually shows teams perform better when there's pre-briefs. And I know we don't always have time for pre-briefs, but it is good to establish that shared mental model and task allocations. And then you can also do some tactical breathing. But you should also make sure that you have time to rest and time to replenish your team. Managing patients, big sick patients, in these environments that we work in, really takes some special consideration. In leadership, we know that our performance and the performance of our team gets affected in these environments, and therefore we always need to be aware of it. And we have to specifically focus on training leaders and thinking of innovative ways of doing this so that they can develop clarity and understanding and vision and agility to manage these situations and their team. Because strong teams deserve strong leaders. And personally, I think our patients deserve it.
Awesome as always, MJ. Thank you so much. A brilliant talk. Any questions from the audience? Yep. I'll come down and pass it down.
Thank you very much. Great talk. I suppose it's a question about the simulation piece and cognitive load. There's fairly strong evidence that if you overload people, then their ability to learn is lost, that you lose that reflective opportunity because you've taken them beyond the point of meaningful learning. So how do you resolve the kind of Sweller approach to cognitive load theory with that approach of stressing people in a kind of VUCA environment?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I think especially when you develop simulation courses, you need to build on things. So what we do over these courses is we start slowly on day one, because no one knows one another. Everybody's still a little bit unsure. You know, all of the, consultants are very rah-rah. All of the paramedics are a little, well, I don't know about this guy. And we slowly work them up. And by day 3, we really, really push them hard. Because in reality, if you don't do this in a safe simulation environment, they might face that, somewhere in the real world and be completely unprepared. And the advantage of simulation is you always have time for debrief. So that's sort of why, but I agree with you. You should be very careful in not starting day 1 and breaking people, because it can be psychologically damaging.
Thank you. Any more?
MJ, good to see you, and thank you for
nice
that
to see you
talk. This is, I guess, a question stemming on for it. It's something I've wondered. Do good teams really need leaders? There's a lot of emphasis in society about leaders, and we see some very odd characters emerge in leadership roles that perhaps do a damn sight more harm. My country's done this Brexit business. You showed 2 complete morons that are in leadership roles, and I'm saying this because the best teams I've worked with function regardless who the leader is, and they function because they've practiced in a good team, and that makes me wonder if actually a really evolved team evolves to a point where the leadership is irrelevant. Do you agree with that, disagree with that?
I agree with it to a point. I think the model that you really want is shared leadership. And we see that more often in the OR as well as in pre-hospital care, where there's really shared leadership. I mean, I know when I get on scene, the paramedic is the team leader for all the scene management. I'm just there to do, some additional skills and things. And I think that whole concept you need to get into a team, that it is a shared leadership model, and it is that agility that you get into these environments is quite important. I think a lot of the VUCA literature comes from the military. It was first described with the Army War College. So, leadership is very strong within military settings, but I think you're right. As a team evolves, leadership becomes sort of part of the whole team dynamic.
Brilliant, thank you so much. I was just thinking, it's like, I remember stories like, you were saying how you can't remember hearing things and seeing things. I remember doing a pre-hospital job with you quite early on in our basics careers, and finishing the job, and sort of getting back in the car and saying, MJ, did you see how pretty that girl was on scene? And she didn't even notice. She even told me off for being unprofessional. I mean, this is unbelievable.
I did not see a girl on the scene.
But it wasn't the patient. Thank you, MJ. It's awesome. So we do a lot of stuff and see a lot of nasty stuff in our jobs, and that load doesn't go away. And also the things, not just that we see, the pressure that we put ourselves under, and the things that we worry about. I know personally for me, when I come back from a job, I am upset if something bad has happened to somebody, but I'm more upset if I don't think I've performed well enough, and I put myself under that pressure again and again. And my friends and my family say, what's happened to you, man? And it's like, no, I just did a really bad job the other day. I missed these things, and these things sort of roll on. These pressures build up, and I think we're beginning to recognise the pressures that we put ourselves under, and some of the risks of burnout and resilience, which interestingly, I don't know how it's in Denmark, but certainly in the UK, resilience is becoming one of these words that can be a good word or a bad word depending on how you're using it. But our next speaker, I'm going to try and say this name correctly, Vibeke, have I said it? Vibeke, sorry. Vibeke Svennum is a pre-hospital physician in Denmark and also works at the University Hospital in Denmark as well. And she's going to talk about some of these themes and explore what it means to us as practitioners.
Okay, thank you for the nice introduction. And it's nice to be here. It's a nice conference and I learned a lot this morning. Now I'm a bit nervous because I heard Ross what he said about presentation, so I hope you bear with me. So, this conference is about delivering the best care for your patients. So this morning and also yesterday you heard from experts in various fields in pre-hospital medicine, critical care, research, and I'm sure that you're all inspired to do better for your patient when you get back. However, there might be something individually or organizational-wise that does that maybe they will not benefit from your new knowledge gain. I was here last year, after a few months after I lost a colleague to suicide due to depression. And this is the third colleague I lose within the last few years. So despite that, the last few years I've been gone to various places to learn to practice medicine in various environments like polar, mountain, or even space medicine. It's sort of like when I get back there is sort of like a dilution of my motivation, which I also see in some of my colleagues. Even though that you struggle because in short moments we still love our jobs, and maybe some of you will feel the same. So I started to wonder why we feel like this, and so this talk is a bit about the journey along this way. So a study of more than 12,000 Australian physicians showed that around 20%, around 20%, oh that's really loud. Yeah, okay. 20% has been diagnosed or treated for depression, and 30 or 25% have thought about killing themselves, and actually 2% had tried. Almost 50% reported a high level of emotional exhaustion and physical or high level of cynicism. All these symptoms align with burnout, cynicism, anger, meanness, silence, and maybe even for some it goes undetected. Also, maybe maladaptive behaviors like substance abuse, alcohol, prescriptive drugs, or other sleep disorders, or other healthcare manifestations, or it could also be heart disease. However, the term burnout doesn't resonate well with healthcare professions. We see ourselves like resilient. And sort of burnout sort of resembles like a lack of resourcefulness. Resilience, it sort of sounds like a career-ending term, which could contrast our normal view on ourselves through our training. So it's quite stressful to experience. And also many of you might think that burnout is something that happens to people who are being unprofessional or being, sorry for my voice, being unprofessional or less resilient. However, many of you are likely to be very, very resilient, or where you've set aside sleep, you've set aside family time, holiday, and maybe mental and physical manifestations for years. So you have most likely been very resilient. Furthermore, casting the issue as a personal problem might force physicians or other healthcare providers to find a solution for themselves. Maybe they'll start doing part-time, maybe they'll quit the career, do something else, or maybe actually someone they will start to or quit life altogether and commit suicide, which we have seen in healthcare, unfortunately. So in 2019, burnout was added to the International Classification of Diseases with this under this chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. And it's not a medical condition, but more like an occupational disorder. So it's characterized emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and reduced professional efficacy. So maybe this is something that some of you may recognize. So before, it was more of like we look at the individual that was not resilient, and now it's more like a new definition that is due to work stressors. So it is found, like you spoke about, leadership, and one of the major factors have shown that leadership is really one of the major issues if we feel engaged or burn out. One study found these 7 drivers or key drivers of burnout engagement, and they found these 7 main areas to whether you engage or you burn out. And one of the major issues is how leadership will drive the personnel or the workers, whether it's less optimal and you burn out or more optimal and you will engage. So actually the leadership point is so important when you look at burnout, that if you try to score the highest, your nearest leader on a 60-point scale score, that actually just 1 point increase in your score of your nearest leader will affect that, will decrease a 3.3 decrease in the likelihood of burnout. Furthermore, so it has a huge impact. Furthermore, actually one of the major things that we're looking at our leader is if they can see our individual skills. So this has a huge importance how we see our leader. Furthermore, it's found that if doctors use 20% of the time, working time, on something they feel inspired about, it severely reduces the risk of burnout. So if you look at burnout on a scale, a 7-point scale, 1 point increase in that scale or 1 point decrease on a satisfaction scale of 5-point scale, you will see that just these small changes will actually see that how it affects your workforce. So there is a likelihood of 30 to 40% decrease, or likelihood of that you will decrease your work efficiency over the next 2 years. So burnout has a huge impact on your professional efficacy, as it's shown. Sorry. So when you look at the nearest leaders, this has a huge impact on how you spend your working day. So when leadership fails, you don't see it maybe as how you present your leader or how you score your leader, but for the individual, when leadership fails, you will see that maybe that you will work too many hours, your clinical time will be compromised, you might experience bullying at your work, sexism. There might be a whole lot of consequences for the individual if the leadership fails. Also on national scales, right now, that if you have in the public, if they speak about healthcare providers, for example, if you're devaluated or there are budget cuts or increased demand of productivity, it affects also the individual doctors. On a national level, I just read the other day that there is 1,000 French doctors who are threatening to resign due to they want new healthcare reform. So it also means something on a national level if leaders on a national level fails. In 2017, there was implemented a new IT system in parts of Denmark, and actually was so it affected the work so much for some physicians. Actually, they resigned. There are some of my colleagues here who work in that part of Denmark, and maybe they can elaborate a bit on that. But it really means something how the leadership works also on a national level. Also another thing, like we spoke about the IT, it actually it's so significant that just by itself it has an implication on how we work, and it's found that actually it's called the electronic elephant in the room. So it means so much for people if they have an effective system. So if you implement this on a national level, it can also affect the individual worker in hospitals, as it's done in some places in Denmark. So in general, it's found that burnout and engagement is an imbalance of reward and effort, or reality versus expectations. So it's found, though, however, that in some other parts of healthcare, there is a lot lower level of depression and anxiety and PhD, as we've seen in, for example, in other parts of pre-hospital medicine as firefighters or police officers. It is found that in HEMS, that these levels are a lot lower. So in 2019, I looked at HEMS in 3 places just to see if their level of burnout was lower, because their level of PTSD, anxiety, and, for example, depression was lower as well. So I looked at 79 crew members 51 from Denmark, and there was 22 from the UK, and there was a unit working here in the Italian Swiss Alps, provided 6 members. And also it constituted of like 20 paramedics and 21 pilots and 38 physicians. So I looked at personal inventory, dockside traits and work stresses and burnout and resilience, as this tells something about how were they working and also the level of burnout. So the personality inventory, just to see how the population is, I found that they resemble what we see in extreme environments. They all are very like emotional stability is one of the things, and high emotional stability and taskability predicts high performance, which we also see in extreme environments, where emotional stability and taskability makes people adapt well to extreme environments, and we saw sort of like the same group of people also working in the HEM setting. Then we looked at dockside traits. Dockside traits tell something about how people perform under stress. Like we just heard, when people are under stress, they go back to a certain pattern that they had already. And if you look at dockside traits here, there are like 11 main types, and out here on your right side, it shows some of the strength of these dockside traits. However, as you see, if you experience people under stress, you will also see that it also has some weaknesses, these dockside traits. However, sometimes you need to work with people for a longer time before you realize what those are and that you recognize it. So if you see the Danish unit, you see here that there is a high level of imaginative and diligent, and those 2 dockside traits were the one we saw was the most frequently reported in physician, and in the Danish unit it was imaginative, and in the UK unit we saw diligent also, but we didn't see anyone imaginative, which was a bit surprising when we look at this. So regarding stresses, I looked at 43 stressors that we know from HEMS, we know from extreme environments, and also you spoke about like vibration and noise and all these things. HEMS crew members are quite affected by that, so they range cluster effect of stressors quite high. I think it's quite interesting because if you see stressors, they're quite similar in their how they perceive stressors. Like for example, of course, patient care and also the environment by itself. For the Alpine unit, we saw the environment and aircraft safety, of course, are quite high, while patient care for the Danish unit and the UK unit ranked high. However, like they have this shared view on stresses. For example, in the top range, in the 5 top range for pilots, stressors are like patient care or care for children and also for relatives. I think that's kind of interesting, but also maybe quite understandable, while the paramedic and the doctor, they treat the patient, and as a pilot maybe you are left with the relatives, which is quite an important task and also can be quite stressful, and maybe by years you will have some tools to deal with that, but maybe actually not trained to deal with relatives in that sense that you're put in that situation. So we also looked at burnout due to work. I assessed burnout by the Copenhagen Burnout Inventory, which has in client or in patient, and by work and also personal. But personal inventory was not assessed due to I was looking at work. Of course, personal stresses can also affect how you work, but this was not assessed in this study. So one of the questions is, do you feel burnout because of your work? And there's no real definition on how much you need to feel burnout to be burned out, or for how long time you need to be burned out. Like there's no any diagnostic tool for it. But however, I think it's quite interesting when we look at the graph here. If we see the Danish and the Alpine unit, you see that 67% never felt burned out because of work, and I think that's quite high numbers. And then in the UK unit, you see 27%. Which I think is quite a remarkable difference. There's no difference between professions in how if they feel burnout, but this was statistically significant also. And then also in the UK unit, you see that 14% is often burnout, which there was no the other ones who reported being burnout often. So imaginative and bold and diligent are protectors against burnout in some studies, and I think it's quite interesting that in the UK unit we didn't see anyone imaginative, and they are also the one who most burn out. There might be a lot of factors, as we spoke about. It's not like necessarily the individual, but also the organizational part of it. So probably it has something to do with this. So also when we looked at, the resilience, we also saw that it was a group of highly resilient people in general that scored quite high. So in summary, the HEM setting, you see that people resemble people who are high performers, like in extreme environments. They deal with many stressors, and the level of stresses were no difference between the units or the location. So it's interesting because actually the Alpine unit had the lowest level of resilience, but I think also in the environment and the alternated performance of the aircraft probably makes that they use some of their resilience to mediate and moderate the stresses of their environment. So maybe this is why we didn't see any effect of this. So even in high performance areas that you see that people get burned out, but the study was not set up to understand why it was like that. That's sort of like maybe a part to look at on afterwards. So I do recognize the symptoms and manifestations of burnout. Statistically, some of you here as well might be aware of that. But I think like in the former, we had a work codex where I worked, and it said the patient first, but I think in the HEM setting, I think they really maybe better understand is that there needs to be a partnership between people and skill set and patient care and leadership. And I think that's due to a small setting that sometimes this is much easier maybe to promote in this HEM setting. So there's a lot of advantages in HEM setting compared to in-hospital setting. So in the military, there's somebody operate now with an operational stress injury, and I think maybe this is something that's much more covers that when like sort of like the impact that a certain setting can have on individuals than maybe burnout, because burnout sounds so career-ending term. So I think that maybe we should look at that, and maybe now it has been a new in the classification of diseases. I think maybe we can start to look a bit closer on what's going on. What does it mean to be burnout in a clinical setting? So some of your colleagues are suffering. Maybe some of you as well have felt burnout. But I think despite that, maybe our understanding is changing more about what burnout is in healthcare. I think that some things that we can do is that to understand that burnout is a fluctuating state. And I also think it's important that where you work, you try to identify which stresses are significant to you, and also respect that maybe some of your colleagues have different stresses depend on who they are and their personality inventory, dark side traits. So there could be done something. And also think we need to think about maybe what is your motivational 20%. If a doctor spends like 20% minimum on something they like, it's a big protector against burnout. So try to define what maybe your 20%. We had before, he spoke about like going out to teach on schools, and that could be a big motivation. But many of you maybe are doing many hours in your workplace. It could be difficult to do something that 20% that you like. Another thing is that you need to hold leadership accountable where you work. There needs to be a set that you will be able to perform, because there are several studies that shows that doctors are high performers, also other pre-hospital healthcare providers. So if you, like I said, you have set aside so many things for so many years, so it is a highly resilient group also in the HEM setting. So you just need, maybe we should be better to do a setup where we're able to perform at a high level. And then please know the manifestation of burnout. You'll be able maybe to save a patient or a family or a life. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for soldiering on with your sore throat, but a really important topic. Thank you so much for that. We are running a little bit behind. I'm trying to catch up. So is there any pressing questions? Or I'm going to give one question for myself, unless anyone's got anything pressing they want to ask. So I was just going to say, a lot of the people in the room, I mean, we're quite a low-achieving group in this room, I think, but have multiple jobs. And I find, for me personally, that when I'm feeling stress, it's usually the HEMS work that will give me the highest level of stress. But that's not where it manifests. It's not in my hospital work when I'm doing an awake fibre optic or a difficult airway case or a high-risk thoracic case. But it's a day surgery case that is the lowest risk part of my job, where I will suddenly probably be at my most dangerous and most distracted when I'm tired. What do we do about people? How do you pick it up in people that you don't see every day?
I think that's an interesting question. So I think if you start by your own thoughts about this, I think, like you said, that you don't feel it in your HEMS. When you're doing your HEMS work, that might be the most stressful, but they also be where you get your motivation to do the rest of your work. But I think, like, when you look in your own department, maybe that you see that somebody is changing personally. They may maybe become more cynical. Like, for example, I work in an intensive care unit, and when we speak about cases, maybe somebody say there's no reason to do anything, it's going to die anyway. And I know this a bit from myself, that I recognize this. So I think, like, one of the things is if you start changing personality, or you see colleagues that normally not behave like that, it could also be like this, try to avoid cases, or avoid helping my vaccine. Maybe they're just trying to preserve themselves. So it's not necessarily because they're lazy or...
Yeah, no, I understand that. I think it's very important.
Personal changes, yeah.
I think it's very important in our culture as an organisation, you know, from the leadership, that we acknowledge this and we talk about it, because otherwise people coming through and people, you know, who feel themselves to be lower down in the hierarchy, whether that's true or not, will feel that they can't speak about it. And I think it's very important that we acknowledge and talk about this. But thank you so much. Now, many times in my career and personal life I've been called a space cadet. But Vahe Ender is a critical care paramedic from Boston, and he works in an EMS system from a Boston hospital with a critical care paramedic and critical care nurse system. And he has looked at, in depth, at some of the lessons that we can learn from the Apollo missions. Though I've never made it to space, except in people taking the piss out of me, Vahe is going to talk to us about high-performance teams and how we really get them to work. And Vahe, if we can finish a little bit ahead of time,
I can do that.
Then we can make Ross's special presentation train.
Which, as a heads up, I don't know if you've seen on Facebook, the train that has been picked has been pushed back, so check your messages if you plan on attending. I just got that message. First, I just wanted to thank the entire organization committee, as well as the entire sort of AV team that provides this to everybody, including out there on the web. Sorry, I'm just looking for my slide advancer. Thank you. I think a lot about healthcare quality, and there's a reason for it, which is that I'm part of a team who works on developing quality and sort of managing healthcare metrics, but also doing clinical development for a primary response, but also a retrieval team in the United States. That's vastly different from what the systems that currently are in place here in Europe. We're a nurse and paramedic staffed model that's involved in the retrieval of newborns, children, and adults, including anything from standard RSV high-flow nasal cannula all the way up to Impella with ECMO as well for LV decompression. So it's certainly a challenge for us. And so this is something that I've been involved in for about 8 years. I was in an antique store in New Orleans. If you've ever been there, it's a great place to be. And I came across this globe, and it stood out to me. At first, I was like, oh, this is just a standard moon globe that just shows us all of the different various pockmarks across the surface of the moon. But as I rotated it, I suddenly noticed a difference, which is that we had an entire area that was beautifully displayed, where we had down to the finest details everything on one side, but then on the other side I was struck by the fact that it was largely blank. I was not alive at the time of sort of the lunar exploration, but suddenly this kind of stood out as a symbol to me about the fact that this object represented the process through which we understood and we learned about the moon. Now I'm a nerd, so obviously I start to think about how this actually also sort of equates to the way that we think and understand our organizations, where I think we have a pretty good understanding of a lot of what goes on over there, but within every single one of your institutions, whether it's a hospital or out-of-hospital retrieval team, there are entire areas that are effectively sort of the unknown. These are places that you simply may not be aware of, effectively the dark side of the moon. So I was kind of struck by this object because it kind of symbolized sort of this transition period where we were trying to learn more and understand more and really ultimately explore the moon. And so I got into kind of a deep dive about the Apollo space program. And as I read and more about the program by NASA to actually place a man on the moon, I was struck by certain things that I started to sort of see within my own organization and that you likely will see within your own institutions as well. And so I wanted to use the context of the Apollo space program to talk about achieving high-performing healthcare quality in the pre-hospital setting. It all started with a speech. In 1962, JFK started, at the time, there was a lot of hesitation about the costs of actually trying to send somebody to the moon. JFK presented and gave a speech in Houston that's considered to be one of the greatest speeches that's ever been recorded. And as I listened to it, first I was sort of amazed at how good of an orator he is, but the other thing that stood out to me was the fact that in that moment, in that speech, in front of millions of people across the globe, what he did was he committed his entire organization and an entire country and an entire system towards the idea of trying to send somebody to the moon. Many people remember the speech for the segment that talks about that we choose not to go there because it is easy, but because it is hard. But the part that stood out to me the most was, in the immediate following sentence, he says, because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and our skills. And I think that that stood out to me as sort of the unifying piece that kind of brings teams together. It's from that speech and through this program that at that time $22 billion were spent, which in today's money would be $250 billion spent. A team made up of 400,000 people, hundreds of contractors and subcontractors that all came together and started to retool themselves and repurpose themselves in order to come together under a single mission. George Mueller, or Mueller as they call him in the US, was selected to be the one to be the director for the Office of Manned Spaceflight. It was going to be his job to lead these 400,000 people, all of their conflicting interests, and all of these contractors, all of these moving pieces of a machine, put them together into a singular machine with the sole purpose of going to the moon. He agreed to it. He took a pay cut. He gave up his time, a huge portion of his life, ultimately so that then we could accomplish this common goal of bringing everybody together and placing somebody on the moon. And he ended up agreeing to the job as long as he was granted the right to restructure the entire organization and retool the entire institution that is NASA to be able to accomplish this mission. And he did so with great compassion. JFK visited NASA to see how the program was advancing. And JFK is walking down the hallway with a whole bunch of people in suit and tie, and there's a janitor in the hallway. And he says, "Hi, sir. And what do you do here?" JFK, the President of the United States, says to a janitor, and the janitor replies, while he was mopping, "I'm helping put a man on the moon, sir." Which highlights to me the idea of how having a common unifying mission. How as an organization you have to decide and you have to commit and choose what you want your mission to be, because from there you can then drive and push the organization forward. Many people think that the space program simply involved preparing a whole lot for many, many years and spending a lot of money to then put 3 people in a rocket and take off. But what people don't realize is that before we could ever send somebody even up into the area that we were hoping to get people to, we had to even figure out if it was safe. The Pegasus program, for example, was simply a satellite that counted the number of times it was hit by small little meteors so that we could understand whether or not it was even safe for people to proceed towards the moon. And so we think of NASA's program of sending someone to the moon as a singular rocket, the Saturn V rocket sitting on the pad, but the reality is that every single great goal is made up of small incremental pieces. This just happens to be a small piece of a very lengthy, complex process to get someone up there. And so as they developed all the technology and as the Saturn V or Saturn V rocket was assembled, we got closer and closer to being able to finally try to place somebody out on the moon. And someone needed to be the first to do a lot of validations. These three fine men climbed into the Apollo 1 capsule. The entire purpose was just a slow incremental step towards launching a rocket and going to the moon, and their step in this entire process was simply to get into the rocket, do all of the preparatory procedure, preparation of the capsule, and simply just to detach the rocket from the launch pad. From that point, the test would be over. They would reattach the rocket and retether it, and then from there they would get out. There was a wiring problem in Apollo 1's module. And right by his seat, there was an electrical arc. The capsule's environment and atmosphere was 100% oxygen, and so suddenly it spontaneously caught fire. The capsule was engulfed in seconds. The astronauts attempted to try to jettison the door, but were unable to get the door open because of the way that these had been designed. It had ultimately been pressurized so that they would be unable to open it from the inside successfully unless they went through a series of steps that could take up to 90 seconds. All three of them perished in this capsule. It almost entirely ended this program. The public started to question as to whether it was something worth actually doing. The costs were brought up. The White House was actually split. There were groups amongst the White House that were attempting to sabotage, from a fiscal standpoint, the entire Apollo space program. In the subsequent investigations, 1,000 changes in the electrical systems were made alone. 400 design changes were made. The way that the capsule, the entire composition of the atmosphere inside the capsule was changed out of this singular incident. Gene Kranz here, immediately after this happened, immediately after the fire, before they had an understanding of what had happened, said a single speech. I would never expect you to read this off my slide. But there are things that stand out to me and that should stand out to every single one of you here, which is that even though he was part of flight control, a small piece of a very big machine, he drove everyone to understand that that singular problem was affecting every single person amongst the team. And the word we were not ready. We did not do our job. Tough means that we are forever accountable for what we do and what we fail to do. This language specifically drives towards the idea of not just individual ownership, where every single team member takes ownership ultimately of the outcome and of their work every single day in the common goal of accomplishing the mission, but it transpires into an entire organizational culture of ownership, where every single person together makes a piece of a mission that is fully committed altogether towards the outcome. So following all of these revisions were the series of next steps of training and developing the entire program to be able to actually get somebody to be able to walk on the moon. It involved making a large replica model of the moon up there on the top right, based off of the best available photos that we had, a huge model, and then someone holding a camera which would then be fed towards the screen of the astronauts as they were practicing reentry. The highest form of simulation available at the time, made in some of the funniest low-tech systems. In order to be able to practice moonwalks, obviously, they used airplanes. This constant repetition required some of the most advanced computer systems available in the world at the time in order for them to do 29,000 hours of practice before they were able to get someone on the moon. This practice prepared them. This is the practice that ultimately allowed them to be able to execute the mission. But there's something else out of this practice, which is that it, just as importantly, allowed them to have the exposure, the experience, and the acquisition of an instinct that allowed them, that in the most critical moments I'll talk about, allowed them to be able to problem solve, to be able to work through things that had been totally unanticipated, had been bought through the practice through 29,000 hours. When you look at ultimately one of the major drivers between, for high-performing teams is the ratio between training and operational time. And we see that with the systems that I know that are in this room here. The highest performing critical care retrieval and otherwise pre-hospital response teams commit themselves to the idea that we cannot simply try to develop our craft through the actual execution of the work at the patient bedside, in the roadside, in a nightclub, wherever it may be, but instead that it has to happen before we ever take off. And that every single one of those high-performing teams commits to trying to ensure the highest ratio of the training to operational time. And so they practiced over and over and over again. Neil Armstrong had done 150 landings on the moon as replicated in the one that before he had ever done one, actually landing on the lunar surface. They had gone through practicing everything, including what do we do once we get on the moon? They did so even before they had the suits, before they had an opportunity to practice it using the suits that they'd be wearing themselves out there on the moon. And so all of this rehearsal bought them safety, bought them margin, which is what you do every single time you train. You are buying yourself margin for when things go wrong. But one thing that stood out is that we focus a lot on the astronaut. These cool guys with these headsets. They got gifted Corvettes. They wore Omega Seamaster diver watches. But one thing that stands out is the fact that they had a fully integrated team where everybody could do each other's work. Much like special operations, where even if you have a set occupational specialty, such as a medic, you oftentimes are cross-trained as a breacher or an engineer or vice versa. And so this team here was fully integrated with the idea that anybody in the team could do any other person's job. So the idea of the silos, whether it be based on specialty, because some of them had expertise in piloting more so than others, instead of saying, your job is this, his job is that, instead, they realized that it doesn't really matter that much about the individual, and that the outcome of the lunar landing doesn't really rely on the idea of a singular person, whatever their title and whatever their provider level be, or whatever their specialty might be. That ultimately, a system that relies on a sole individual ultimately has a liability and a point of weakness within their entire organization. And so thinking about how we design our healthcare systems, we have to think about how allowing teams to be separated and fragmented in their training, right, in their accountability internally within your own institution, expectations and standards. If there are differences between your teams, amongst your team members, then that is a liability and that is a point of weakness for your entire system. Because in the moment when now things start to go wrong, where you have bought yourself that margin, if you have an integrated team with as much crossover, as much cross-training possible between your team members, you're buying yourself more room to be able to then work. It means that you can then cognitively offload a provider to be able to do a certain procedure that maybe only they can do. Or maybe give a provider the room to be able to manage the logistics that maybe only they have an experience in managing. That is the value of a fully integrated team. Another part is the commitment to the idea of highly regimented and standardized processes. I think it's no surprise, obviously, that the space program was highly structured in the way that they trained. They had extensive checklists. You can download them online. They're hundreds of megabytes in size. And every single one of these checklists was drilled, rehearsed, so that it allowed for them to have a flow. Because the idea is that you're trying to decrease practice variation where it counts, where you can, and you can try to decrease the amount of entropy so that then you have a highly reliable, repeatable process. An organization that does every transport in a singular way, right, where each one is individually different, and there isn't any sort of commitment to trying to establish a fundamental sort of goal for each patient type. For example, in intracranial hemorrhage, an organization that doesn't have set hemodynamic goals and relies on individual provider preference, that inherently is an organization that is not fully unlocking the potential within their systems. Having a fundamental level of clinical and operational and performance expectation is the most essential piece to be able to then do the next step. So they take off. After all of these incremental steps and a commitment to having a highly structured system, Saturn V, the Apollo 11 team takes off. And so they make 2 evolutions around the Earth, they increase overall their velocity, they do a controlled burn, and they break free of the grasp of Earth itself, and they slingshot towards the moon. And they make it to the moon. And so now, this vehicle, this is the Lunar Command Module, attached to it on the front nose should be Eagle, which is a landing craft. And as they rotate around the moon, they prepare for their descent. There's a problem inherently, which is that anytime the command module goes behind the Earth, or anytime Eagle otherwise is separated from the command module, and it's behind the moon, Earth is not able to track them. It's a black hole. And so Earth, anytime they lose contact, are effectively asking for position checks. And so the way to work around this so that Earth is able to see the position of the Eagle lunar lander at all times is to try to have 2 radar systems engaged. Where now, Eagle is talking to the Lunar Command Module, which you see photographed, to be able to send it down to the moon. And so they break free. And this position of Eagle right here is being tracked through these radars. And Eagle is going to be the craft that's going to make its entry. They are starting at 50,000 feet, and they're slowly making their way down.
1202, standing by. 1202.
Except something happens.
1202 alarm. 1202, what's that? 1202 alarm. It's the executive.
The guidance computer has suffered a fault. It's lit up like a Christmas tree. There are lights all over flashing, and the astronauts have never seen this alarm or this alert before. It indicates 1202. What has happened is that the 2 radar signals have, as a result, saturated the 4 kilobytes of RAM, 4 kilobytes that the system had, right? And has saturated and used up all of its available computing power. And so now, through unbelievable design, this system is trying to shed processes as much as possible to be able to, based on priority it's been told, secure and guarantee the approach towards the moon. But the problem is the astronauts don't know that that's actually what's happening there. And the reality is that the majority of the team don't know that either, except for one person, who in the preceding weeks, through repetition, through attempting to induce error within their system, constantly trying to find weaknesses, had made a handwritten list of just exhaustive numbers of faults and errors that the lunar guidance system could have. And when he hears 1202, having poked all of the possible holes that he could identify, he suddenly remembers, I know this number. I remember this. Because the question is, are we about to abort and come back to Earth? And that was a very real question at that time. And he skims through his notes, a person who had committed and taken ownership in his work and had, through repetition, found the faults and the errors within the system, had identified 1202. And he looked in his notes and he said, we know what this is. It is not a mission-ending error. And so they were then told to proceed. But in that moment, in that singular moment, within over seconds that played out, they almost aborted the mission.
It's executive overflow. If it does not occur again, we're fine. It has not occurred again. Okay, we'll go. Continue. We're going on flight. We're going on. Roger, we got you. We're going on alarm. Will we go? He's taking in a dive.
And so based on his singular input, the entire team says, okay, we are a go. And so then every other department says you are a go with continuing to the mission. And so Eagle does its approach and is making its way towards the pre-selected landing spot. The problem is that where they initially intended to land is going to be right here, amongst an area that they, based on their imaging and resolution of the cameras that they had available, they didn't realize that there was a shelf, a ridgeline, and a series of meteor impact sites, which meant that if they attempted to land, they would suffer dynamic rollover, the entire team would be killed instantly. So in that moment, Neil Armstrong ends up taking manual control of the lunar landing module and ends up guiding Eagle down onto the surface of the moon manually. Despite the fact that they had the most advanced systems in place, the most advanced guidance and inertial systems and sensors in the world, in that moment, ultimately, that final piece relied on the human factor. And when thinking about the way that we design our healthcare systems, we need to think about it, much like Gareth Davies talks about, with the pyramid, that we need to build on fundamentals of highly reliable, highly structured, with organizational ownership, common unifying mission, so that from there, in that moment, when suddenly there's the unpredictable and the unexpected, you have room, you have bought yourself room in safety and margin through repetition and training, but you also, through your process of giving your providers the room to then be able to use the judgment that they then have in that moment, the sort of tailored therapy when it is needed. That ultimately is how we end up with the final step of stepping on the moon, which is the culmination of all of these different pieces. And that ultimately had very little to do with the individual provider and the individual astronaut, but actually was ultimately the sum of all of the pieces coming together. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's absolutely fascinating. Now, I'm sure questions, we could probably wait till the bar afterwards, because I realise it's time for skiing, and this is obviously what none of you have come here for, because you come just for the talks. But is it all right if we do questions in the bar afterwards? So 12:48 is going to be the train time for Ross Fisher, not 12:24, and it is going to be awesome. So if you can make it, I'd really recommend Ross's talk. I'll hand you over to Erzamat.
So heli ski